"Our army must be different from yours," Ibrahim Traoré told the French chief of staff, "because our war is different from yours." This simple sentence signaled the end of 60 years of post-colonial military dependency Traoré would completely reject. The Western military model built on sophisticated weapons and complex doctrines, creating an entirely new defense force suited to Burkina Faso's realities. The meeting took place in the presidential palace in Ouagadougou on a sweltering afternoon. In July, present were Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, his defense minister, Colonel Kassim Koulibaly, and across the table, General Pierre Monenlaer, chief of the French military mission that had operated in the country for over 3 decades. The atmosphere was tense. Monenlaer had requested this emergency meeting after hearing rumors of impending changes to the military cooperation agreement between France and its former colony. He had come prepared with statistics presentations and thinly veiled warnings about the consequences of any radical shifts in policy. "Mr. President," Monenlaer began, his tone professionally cordial but tinged with condescension, "I understand your government is considering revisions to our military training partnership. I'd like to present some facts about what France has provided over the years." He proceeded to list impressive-sounding figures too. 800 Burkinab officers trained at French military armies, €450 million in equipment donations, 140 French military advisors currently stationed in country intelligence support drone surveillance capabilities. Traoré listened silently, his expression unreadable. At 34, he was half Monenlaer's age, but carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had reached decisive clarity. After long deliberation, when the French general finished, Traoré spoke without referring to any notes. "General Monenlaer, for 30 years, your country has trained our officers, equipped our forces, and advised our commanders. In that same period, our security situation has deteriorated from stable to catastrophic. Insurgent groups now control nearly a third of our territory. Last year alone, we lost 300 soldiers and civilians to attacks." The statement hung in the air, its implication clear, but unstated. French military support had failed to deliver security. Monenlaer shifted uncomfortably. "The situation is complex, Mr. President. The Sahel faces unprecedented challenges: climate change, driving resource competition, porous borders, international terrorist networks." "Indeed," Traoré interrupted calmly, "our challenges are unique to our region, our geography, our social context, yet our military doctrine, equipment, and training remain copied from European models designed for entirely different contexts." He leaned forward slightly. "Our army must be different from yours. Because our war is different from yours, we're not preparing for tank battles in the Fula Gap or precision strikes on industrial infrastructure. We're fighting an enemy that blends with our communities, that understands our terrain better than soldiers trained in French armies ever could." Monenlaer's expression tightened. "Are you suggesting French training is irrelevant to your needs? Our counterinsurgency expertise was developed in Vietnam, Algeria, and Indochina." Traoré finished for him places where, forgive my directness, France was ultimately unsuccessful. The silence that followed was heavy with historical weight. Monenlaer's face flushed slightly. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. President?" "A complete reimagining of our defense forces," Traoré replied, "beginning with the end of the current military cooperation agreement. We thank France for its decades of support, but we will be developing our own military doctrine, training systems, and defense priorities moving forward." The meeting concluded shortly thereafter, with Monenlaer barely concealing his shock and anger as the French delegation departed. Defense Minister Koulibaly turned to Traoré. "They won't accept this easily." He warned the French have military agreements with most of our neighbors. They control regional intelligence, networks, equipment, supply chains, all tools of continued dependency. Traoré said firmly, "If we are to achieve true sovereignty, we must be willing to face the difficult transition period, better short-term challenges than permanent subordination." This exchange marked the beginning of what would become known as the Burkinab military renaissance, perhaps the most ambitious attempt by any post-colonial African state to completely reimagine its defense forces from first principles. The decision wasn't made lightly or impulsively. For months before that meeting, Traoré had convened a series of closed-door sessions with veteran officers, community leaders from conflict-affected regions, and security experts from across Africa. These discussions had revealed a fundamental disconnect between Western military approaches and the realities of Burkina Faso's security challenges. Captain Aisha Ouedraogo, who had served in both SLED operations and indigenous units, described the problem succinctly during one such session. "We're trained to fight like Europeans, but our enemies don't fight like Europeans' enemies. Our officers learn to call for air support that rarely comes to coordinate with technological systems. We don't possess to implement tactics designed for environments, nothing like the Sahel." 2 weeks after the meeting with Montlaire, Traoré addressed the nation in a televised speech that sent shockwaves through Western capitals, standing before maps showing the extent of insurgent control across Burkina Faso's northern territories. He outlined his vision. "For too long, we have attempted to ensure our security using doctrines, equipment, and training developed for different continents, different wars, different realities. Today, we begin the process of creating a truly Burkina defense force, one designed specifically for our unique challenges, terrain, and people," he announced a 5-year transition plan with immediate changes. The French military mission would depart within 90 days. A new National Defense Academy would replace officer training previously conducted in France, and a Defense Research Institute would develop indigenous military doctrine suited to local conditions. The international reaction was swift and largely negative. French media described the move as dangerously naive and politically motivated. Anti-Western sentiment. Military analysts predicted catastrophic security deterioration without Western support. Development agencies warned of potential funding implications within Burkina Faso itself. Reactions were mixed. Some senior officers, particularly those who had built careers within the French influence system, expressed private concerns. Civilians in conflict zones worried about security gaps during the transition, but many younger officers and rank-and-file soldiers embraced the change with enthusiasm. "For the first time, someone is asking what kind of army we need, not telling us what kind of army we should be," remarked Lieutenant Fatima, a promising young officer who would later play a key role in the reformed military structure. The first challenge came immediately, filling the intelligence gap left by departing French assets. French surveillance drones, satellite intelligence, and signals interception had provided the backbone of Burkina Faso's awareness of insurgent movements. Without these, military planners feared operating in an information vacuum. Traoré's solution was characteristically innovative. Rather than attempting to replicate expensive technical intelligence capabilities, he redirected resources toward human intelligence networks. The newly formed civilian defense liaison units recruited from communities in conflict zones, creating networks of local informants with intimate knowledge of terrain, population movements, and unusual activities. "Technology can tell you where a group of armed men was 6 hours ago," Traoré explained to skeptical generals. "A shepherd who lives in the area can tell you where they're going, who's supporting them, and what they're planning next." The approach was labor-intensive but effective. Within months, these networks were providing actionable intelligence that often proved more timely and contextually relevant than the technical intelligence they replaced. Most importantly, they engaged local communities as active participants in their own security rather than passive recipients of protection. The next challenge was reforming officer training. For decades, Burkina Faso's military elite had been educated at prestigious French MEs like Saint-Cyr. These institutions produced technically proficient officers steeped in Western military thinking, but often disconnected from the realities of the environments where they would serve. The newly established National Defense Academy in Ouagadougou took a radically different approach. Its curriculum, developed by a team led by Colonel Samira Sankora, one of the few female senior officers, emphasized practical skills over theory, local conditions over abstract principles, and adaptability over octability. Over octacute. Rigid doctrine: our officers must understand not just military tactics, but the social, economic, and environmental factors that shape our security. Challenges. Sankara explained during the Academy's inauguration. They must speak local languages, respect indigenous knowledge, and build genuine partnerships with communities. The Academy's training grounds replicated the actual environments where officers would deploy. From dense urban neighborhoods to arid border regions, scenarios were based on real incidents with local civilians participating to create realistic complexity. Ethics and community relations received as much emphasis as marksmanship and tactics, perhaps. Most controversially, the Academy invited former insurgents who had accepted amnesty to provide insights into opposition tactics, motivations, and vulnerabilities. This approach, unthinkable in Western military institutions, provided invaluable perspective that no conventional training could offer. As the first class of 120 officers began their training at the new academy, attention turned to the broader challenge of doctrinal development. What exactly would a truly indigenous Burkinafaso military doctrine look like? The Defense Research Institute, established in a repurposed colonial-era building on Ouagadougou's outskirts, tackled this question with a diverse team that included not just military officers, but anthropologists, environmental scientists, community leaders, and security researchers from across Africa. Their work began with a fundamental reassessment of the threats facing Burkina Faso rather than adopting the Western framework that viewed religious extremism as the primary driver of insurgency. They examined local realities more holistically. Our conflicts are not primarily ideological, but resource-based, explained Dr. Aminata Deo, the civilian director of the Institute. Climate change, land pressure, economic marginalization, ethnic tensions, and governance failures create the conditions that extremist groups exploit. Our security approach must address these root causes alongside direct military response. This perspective led to a doctrine that integrated military operations with community resilience initiatives, environmental restoration, and local governance support. Defense forces were reconceptualized, not as a separate entity that arrived to save communities, but as a partner working alongside local structures. The resulting integrated community security doctrine emphasized 5 core principles that departed significantly from Western approaches. Permanent presence: unlike conventional operations that cleared areas only to withdraw, leaving them vulnerable to insurgent return units, would maintain consistent presence in secured zones. Local integration: soldiers would be deployed to regions where they spoke the language and understood cultural nuances, reversing the previous practice of specifically assigning officers outside their home regions. Minimal technology dependence: equipment and tactics would rely on systems that could be maintained and sustained locally, reducing dependency on foreign supply chains and technical support. Environmental adaptation rather than fighting against the harsh Sahelian environment with resource intensive logistics units would be trained to operate in harmony with local conditions. Civilian primacy: military operations would be subordinated to community-led security councils, ensuring that force was used in ways that supported rather than undermined local stability. Western military observers were skeptical, with one French analyst dismissing the approach as security romanticism detached from operational realities. But as the doctrine moved from theory to implementation, results began to challenge these assumptions. The first test came in the northern Sim province, where insurgent groups had effectively controlled significant territory for years. Rather than launching a conventional clearing operation, the reformed Burkinafaso forces implemented their new approach with especially trained battalion soldiers from the region, who spoke local languages, were organized into small semi-autonomous Units embedded directly in communities, they established bases not as fortified compounds, separated from civilian life, but as integrated security hubs where military and civilian resources combined to address both immediate threats and underlying vulnerabilities. Each military unit partnered with a civilian council that guided security priorities. Based on local knowledge, intelligence came primarily from community networks, rather than technical surveillance operations were planned around natural resources like water access points, considering seasonal patterns that shaped both civilian and insurgent movements, were not just securing territory. Explained Captain Mohammed Ouedraogo, who commanded one of these units, were securing livelihoods, water sources, market routes. The systems that communities need to function. When people can live securely, they become our strongest defense against extremist influence. The approach required patience, unlike high-intensity clearing operations favored by Western doctrine. This method focused on gradually expanding zones of stability through consistent presence and community partnership. Progress wasn't measured in enemies killed or territory temporarily controlled, but in civilians returning to abandoned villages, markets reopening, and local governance re-establishing itself after 6 months. The results were promising enough that Traoré authorized expansion to 3 additional provinces, areas that had experienced years of cyclical violence. Clearing operations, followed by insurgent return, began to see sustained stability. Most tellingly, civilian reporting of insurgent activity increased, dramatically indicating growing trust in the security partnership. The reforms weren't without challenges and setbacks. Equipment shortages became acute after France suspended military aid, forcing creative adaptations and difficult prioritization. Several senior officers resigned, uncomfortable with the radical departures from familiar doctrine. Insurgent groups launched fierce counterattacks against what they recognized as a potentially effective approach. Most seriously, an entire company was ambushed and nearly destroyed during an early implementation phase, raising questions about whether the new doctrine adequately prepared forces for high-intensity combat. Traoré acknowledged these challenges directly in a meeting with military leadership. "We're attempting something unprecedented," he told them. "There will be failures, losses, and moments of doubt. But we must ask ourselves, is continuing with approaches that have failed for decades a safer choice? Our people deserve security solutions that actually work in our context, not ones that satisfy foreign military theorists." As the reforms progressed, an unexpected development occurred. Officers from neighboring countries, Mali, Niger, Chad, began requesting permission to observe Burkina Faso's new training academy and doctrinal implementation. These nations faced similar security challenges and had experienced similar frustrations with Western military approaches. Traoré welcomed this interest, establishing a regional security cooperation forum that explicitly excluded former colonial powers. This Sahel security dialogue became a space where African military leaders could share indigenous solutions without Western mediation or influence. 2 years into the reforms, a comprehensive security assessment showed measurable improvements. Insurgent attacks had decreased by 47% in areas where the new doctrine was fully implemented. Civilian casualties had declined even more significantly, perhaps. Most importantly, population displacement had reversed in several regions, with families returning to villages they had abandoned years earlier. The French response evolved from initial dismissal to grudging acknowledgement and finally to careful study. A confidential assessment from the French Defense Ministry later leaked to African media concluded the Burkinafaso approach, while departing significantly from established counterinsurgency doctrine, demonstrates surprising effectiveness in the specific context of the Western Sahel. Particularly noteworthy is its sustainability with limited external support. This last point was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Traoré's military reform. By designing defense forces around local resources, knowledge, and conditions, he had created a system that could function independently of foreign assistance. This self-sufficiency represented true security sovereignty in a region long dependent on external military support 3 years. After the fateful meeting with General Montelaire, Traoré hosted a very different gathering at the National Defense Academy. Military leaders from 12 African nations attended the first Pan-African Indigenous Security Doctrine Conference, where Burkina Faso's experience served as a case study in reimagining post-colonial defense forces. In his opening address, Traoré reflected on the journey. When we began this process, experts told us it was impossible that African armies could not function effectively without Western doctrines, Western equipment, Western training. Today, the evidence speaks for itself, not because our approach is perfect. It isn't, but because it is ours, designed for our realities, our challenges, our people. The impact extended beyond military effectiveness to broader questions of sovereignty, as one Malayan general observed during the conference. For decades, we've been politically independent, but security dependent. True independence requires the courage to imagine our own solutions, even when the entire international security establishment insists we cannot succeed. This perspective reflected a growing sentiment across the continent, where younger leaders increasingly questioned inherited systems and assumptions. Burkina Faso's military reforms became a symbol of this wider movement toward authentic self-determination. For individual soldiers, the changes were profoundly meaningful. Sergeant Fatou Dio, who had served under both the old and new systems, described the difference. Before, we felt like we were implementing someone else's idea of what an army should be. Now we're building something that actually makes sense for our country. The pride in that is immeasurable. The reformed military also changed its relationship with civilians, where rural communities had often viewed soldiers with suspicion as representatives of a distant government speaking different languages and following foreign doctrines. They now increasingly saw them as partners in their own security. The soldiers speak our language now, explained a village elder from eastern Burkina Faso. They understand our customs, respect our ways. They don't just come to fight and leave. They stay, they listen, they become part of our community's life. For years after launching the reforms, Traoré welcomed a special visitor to the Defense Research Institute, General Henry Lair, the new French Chief of Staff. The visit represented a remarkable evolution from the tense confrontation that had initiated the process. "I've come to learn, not to advise," Claire told Traoré candidly. "What you've accomplished here challenges many of our fundamental assumptions about security assistance in Africa." Traoré's response was gracious, but firm. "We value partnership with France and all international allies, but true partnership can only exist between equals, each respecting the other's sovereignty and unique perspective." This principled partnership between equals rather than dependency became the foundation for Burkina Faso's new approach to international military cooperation. The country now engaged selectively with foreign partners, accepting training or equipment only when it aligned with indigenous doctrine and priorities. As Traoré explained to his military command, "We will learn from everyone, east, west, north, south, but we will follow no one. Our security solutions must emerge from our own soil, our own experience, our own understanding of who we are and what we face." The Burkina military renaissance represented more than just technical reforms to defense structures. It embodied a profound psychological liberation, a rejection of the assumption that African security challenges required external solutions. By demonstrating that locally developed approaches could effectively address complex threats, Traoré had challenged decades of post-colonial security thinking. 5 years after the initial reforms, a new generation of officers was rising through the ranks of Burkina Faso's transformed military, trained entirely within the indigenous system. They had never experienced the dependency mindset that carried their predecessors at a graduation ceremony for the National Defense Academy's 5th class of officers. Traoré addressed these young leaders. "You inherit something precious, an institution that was brave enough to question everything, to reimagine itself from first principles. your responsibility is to continue this evolution. Never allowing our defense forces to become rigid or dogmatic, even about our own doctrine, this commitment to continuous evolution rather than dogmatic. Adherence to any single approach, whether foreign or indigenous, perhaps best defined the philosophical heart of Burkina Faso's military transformation. The willingness to question, adapt, and innovate based on local realities had created defense forces uniquely suited to the challenges they faced for Ibrahim Traoré, who had staked his leadership on this controversial reform against significant international pressure. The results vindicated what had been a profound political risk. The improved security situation spoke for itself, but equally important was the sense of national ownership over security solutions. Our greatest achievement isn't any particular tactical success, he reflected during a strategy session with his Security Council. It's the fact that our approach now genuinely belongs to us. Its successes are our successes. Its failures are our failures, but in either case, they are ours to learn from, not lessons imposed from outside. This ownership extended beyond the military to the broader population, who increasingly saw security not as something provided by distant institutions following foreign doctrines, but as a collective responsibility in which they played an active role. As Burkina Faso continued to face significant security challenges, climate change, resource competition, religious extremism, cross-border threats, its reformed defense forces addressed these issues with approaches rooted in local understanding rather than imported theories. The result wasn't perfect security. No such thing existed in the complex environment of the Sahel, but it was authentic security developed by and for the people. It aimed to protect the simple statement that Cade initiated this transformation: our army must be different from yours, because our war is different from yours. Cade evolved from a declaration of independence into a philosophy of indigenous innovation that extended far beyond military affairs. It represented a fundamental reclaiming of the right to self-defend, not just in security matters, but in all aspects of national development. For other African nations watching this experiment closely, the message was powerful: the most effective solutions to African challenges might not come from foreign experts or international institutions, but from the courage to trust local knowledge, experience, and experience and creativity. In this sense, Burkina Faso's military renaissance became about much more than security. It became a testament to the possibility of genuine sovereignty in a world still shaped by colonial legacies. As Traoré often reminded both his military leaders and international partners, security cannot be imported or imposed. It must grow from within, shaped by those who understand not just the terrain of our land, but the terrain of our culture, our history, and our aspirations.